World War II is not just a chapter in a history book. It is the single most defining event of the modern world. It redrew maps, shattered empires, and gave birth to the technologies, the political alliances, and the moral questions that still shape our lives today. Over 75 million people perished in a conflict of unimaginable scale, and from the ashes of that conflict came the United Nations, the Cold War, the Jet Age, and the Nuclear Age. The world we live in is a direct, undeniable product of that war. But what if it never happened? What if, in a single quiet moment, the dominoes that led to the deadliest conflict in human history simply stopped falling? This isn't a simple what-if scenario. This is an exploration of a very different century, a world where the foundations of our modern reality were never laid, and where humanity's darkest ideologies were left to fester in the shadows instead of being brought to a boiling point. The repercussions of this timeline would be felt for generations, creating a future that is utterly alien to us. The tense 1930s, a world on a razor's edge. To understand a world without World War II, we must first look at the one that existed just before it. The 1930s were not a peaceful decade. They were a time of deep economic depression, rising nationalism, and simmering tensions. Fascism was on the march in Europe, led by men like Benito Mussolini in Italy and, most dangerously, Adolf Hitler in Germany. The Soviet Union was under the iron grip of Joseph Stalin, a dictator whose purges and genocidal policies were already underway. The British and French empires were exhausted and deeply reluctant to engage in another major war. The United States was in a state of deep isolationism, convinced that Europe's problems were not its own. The stage was set for a disaster. The Treaty of Versailles had left Germany humiliated and economically crippled, providing fertile ground for Hitler's rise to power. Japan was aggressively expanding its empire in Asia, and in Spain, a brutal civil war was already a preview of the coming conflict. All the pieces were in place. So how could it have been avoided? Let's imagine a single point of divergence. Not a fantastical one, but a plausible one. What if Hitler, instead of consolidating power, was simply neutralized? Perhaps the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, when he purged his political opponents, goes wrong. A single bullet, an unexpected coup, or a successful plot by the German military, who were wary of his radicalism, could have brought his regime to an end before it could seize total control. This single change in this one man would prevent the invasion of Poland and the cascade of events that followed. But it wouldn't eliminate the underlying ideologies. The geopolitical butterfly effect, empires and ideologies. With World War II averted, the geopolitical landscape would be profoundly different. Germany. Without a war to channel its aggressive energies, the Nazi Party's extremist ideology would have been a ticking time bomb. It's highly probable that a conflict would still have erupted, but it would have been a civil war or a series of smaller regional conflicts, not a world war. The Holocaust, as we know it, would likely not have happened in the same systematic industrial scale. However, the deep-seated anti-Semitism and other genocidal beliefs of the Nazi Party would have undoubtedly found other, more fragmented and less coordinated expressions of violence. The horrors would have been real but perhaps confined, never reaching the monstrous scale we know. The world would not have had a single unifying moral evil to rally against. The Soviet Union. Without the external threat of a full-scale Nazi invasion, Stalin's power would have been absolute. The Soviet Union would have faced no common enemy to unite its people against. This could have led to even more internal purges and a deeper isolationism. Without the war, there would be no reason for the Western Allies to lend-lease military equipment to the Soviets, and no reason for a post-war Yalta Conference. The Cold War, as we know it, would have been very different if it happened at all. The Soviet Union might have continued to expand its influence through subversion and political infiltration, but without the physical occupation of Eastern Europe. The British and French empires. The war was a massive drain on the resources of these two great empires. After the war, they were financially and politically crippled, unable to maintain control of their colonies, leading to a wave of decolonization in the 1950s and 60s. Without the war, these empires would have likely persisted for a much longer time. Decolonization would have been a slower, more painful process, possibly marked by decades of smaller conflicts as colonial powers desperately clung to their territories. The modern map of Africa and Asia would look very different today. The United States, World War II pulled the U.S. out of the Great Depression and transformed it into a global superpower. Without the war, the U.S. would have likely remained in a state of isolationism. It would have had no reason to develop the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe, and no reason to form NATO. The U.S. economy would not have been supercharged by wartime production, and it would have recovered much more slowly from the Depression. The modern U.S. as a military and economic hegemon would not exist. It would have been a powerful but inward-looking nation. The technological and social butterfly effect. The impact of a war-free timeline would go far beyond politics. Our entire technological landscape would be fundamentally altered. The nuclear age. The Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bomb, was a direct response to the war. Without it, the world would not have stumbled into the nuclear age so abruptly. The discovery of nuclear fission would have likely been a slow academic process, with no government-funded incentive to turn it into a weapon. We would not have lived under the constant threat of nuclear annihilation, but we would have also missed out on the development of nuclear power as a clean energy source for decades. The information age. The war was a catalyst for the development of computers. The British, in their effort to break the German Enigma code, developed early computers like the Bomb and Colossus. This was the birth of the modern computer. Without the urgency of code breaking, the computer revolution would have proceeded at a much slower pace. The technology would still have emerged, but perhaps not until the 1970s or 80s, and without the massive government investment that fast-tracked its development. The jet age. The first jet aircraft were developed by both sides during the war. The massive investment in rocketry and aerospace engineering would have also been absent. The space race, which was a direct result of the Cold War, would have never happened. We would likely be decades behind in space exploration. Social progress. The war was a major turning point for social progress. It accelerated the civil rights movement in the U.S. and brought women into the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Without the war, these social changes would have been a slower, more difficult climb. The fight for civil rights, for example, would have lacked the moral high ground that the war against fascism provided. The creation of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was a direct response to the horrors of the war. Without it, our global commitment to human rights would have been far less formalized and far less enforceable. Curiosity questions for debate. In this timeline, the world avoided the greatest tragedy in human history. But without the war, would we have missed out on the creation of the United Nations, the push for human rights, and the technologies that define our world today? Was there a trade-off? Ishon, do you believe humanity, given the chance, would have eventually found another way to solve its problems without a global war? Or was a conflict of this scale inevitable? May, if you had the power to prevent World War II, but you knew it would lead to a slower, less progressive, and more unequal world, would you still do it? Why or why not? In this timeline, the world avoids its darkest and most violent chapter. But what is the cost of that peace? It's a peace built on festering resentments, unchallenged ideologies, and a slower, less connected world. It's a world without the unifying tragedy that brought nations together, created global institutions, and fast-tracked our technological future. It's a world that might have avoided the horrors of the camps, but perhaps created 100 smaller ones. It's a world that might have avoided the nuclear bomb, but perhaps missed out on a new age of power. In the end, we're left with a terrifying, profound question. Did humanity, in some deeply twisted way, need the fire of World War II to forge the world we know today? This timeline may seem like a fantasy, but it shows us just how balanced our world truly is. If you want to keep exploring the what-ifs and see how our world could be different, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Timeline Shift, and get ready for our next adventure.